So without any further ado, Dr. Andrew Nichols, parapsychologist, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone.
It is really nice to have you. So you're hailing from Gainesville, Florida, correct?
That's right. 106 degrees it was up here today.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's pretty warm down here, too, Doc.
I'll bet.
Yeah, and you are a professor at Santa Fe Community College, correct?
That's right. I'm an adjunct professor right now. I was a full-time professor and department chair, professor of psychology and department chair at City College for about 15 years, and I semi-retired from teaching last fall, and so now I'm teaching part-time. I teach at Santa Fe, and I also teach abnormal psychology at a local Oriental medicine college.
Well, that's cool. And so you're teaching parapsychology, and let's just start with that. What got you into parapsychology?
Well, that goes back to my childhood. I was born in West Virginia and spent the first 13 years of my life there. And this was during the early to mid and late 1960s. And during that period of time, West Virginia was quite a hot zone for paranormal experiences, even going back into the 1950s with the Flatwoods monster, which was associated with a UFO sighting. But that was a little before my time. But while I lived there was a whole rash of UFO sightings, and, of course, the Mothman phenomenon occurred there in Point Pleasant. Point Pleasant was only about 25 miles from where I lived, a little place called Cross Lanes, and I knew several of the people who had seen Mothman, and also one person who had a rather remarkable UFO sighting. In fact, he appeared very briefly in the book Mothman Prophecies by John Keel. A fellow by the name of Tad Jones was a friend of my father's who owned an appliance store there in Cross Lanes, and he had said that he had seen a spherical craft on tripod legs landed right on the uncompleted branch of Interstate 64 early one morning on his way to work. And so I was fascinated by all this. So that was really the beginning of it. And, like a lot of other kids of those days, I was fascinated with television shows like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. But what really solidified it for me was I had my own paranormal experience. I never did see Mothman or any of the UFOs, but I was collecting the clippings and was interested in it. But when I was 12 years old, my older sister died in an automobile accident. And after her death, I began having a series of recurring nightmares about her death. And this went on for several weeks. I'd wake up in a cold sweat several nights a week. And then one night, something woke me up, and I rolled over, and there she was, standing in my room, just smiling at me. She looked completely solid, wasn't transparent or anything like that, although she did appear to be faintly luminous. I remember being able to see objects in the room that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to see, so there was a kind of a luminous quality to the experience. And when I went to get out of bed, she disappeared. Didn't say anything, which is quite typical for apparitional-type experiences. And that made a profound effect on me, had a profound effect on me. I wasn't sure if I was crazy or what had happened. Never was very religious in a conventional sense. And so I began doing a little research in the library, and I discovered not only do many people have such experiences, that they're actually quite common, but also that there's a whole branch of psychology that specializes in studying just those things, and that would be parapsychology. Yeah. So really from that moment on, from the time I was 12 years old, I was determined that that's what I was going to do. So that's how I got started.
Well, that's good. So you've been doing it for a year or two. So what, you're 29 now? And that puts you,
that's true.
Puts you to about 30 years?
I've been doing serious research, I would say, for about 34 years now.
Although
I was interested in it, again, even longer than that.
Well, in your ensuing 34 years since you had that experience with your sister, have you experienced anything similar?
Well, I have seen apparitions on two other occasions, and this was during haunting investigations. I was investigating Oak Alley Plantation in Vacherie, Louisiana, which some of your listeners may be familiar with because it was used in the movie Interview with a Vampire. Beautiful old plantation. And I saw a young woman looking out the window at me from a second floor window. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. She seemed to be wearing an old-fashioned dress. And again, this was during the daylight. I was walking around outside the plantation, And I really didn't think much of it. Had a camera around my neck, didn't even try to take a picture of her because I assumed she was one of the docents or tour guides that they have. The plantation is a museum now. And so I assumed she was just one of the docents looking out the window. And later on, I got to meet all the docents that were there. There weren't any tourists there on the day that we were there. It was on a Sunday afternoon. And I didn't see this girl among them, so I asked them where she was and who she was, and they told me that there was no such person that worked there, but they told me that it did sound like the ghost that people had seen. So I went up to that room, and actually the window that I had seen her looking out of had a big exhaust fan mounted in it. And so there was actually no way I could have seen a person standing in the place that I saw. Of course, when I went back outside, I could see the exhaust fan very well, and so I really had no explanation for it. So that was an interesting experience. And then the third time was at a place in Denmark called Dralsholm Castle, and on the fourth floor of the castle, which has been turned into a hotel, there's a ghost that people see and have seen for over 200 years. There are records of this ghost. They call her Den Hvide Dame in Danish, which means the lady in white. And, of course, there are a lot of those around the world. But there's a legend that goes along with this one that's actually quite interesting and some interesting evidence. The legend is that hundreds of years ago, a young woman who was the daughter of one of the noblemen who lived in this castle had fallen in love with a stable hand and had become pregnant. And when her family found out about it, they were so furious that she had, become pregnant with this commoner's baby that they decided they were going to kill her. The legend doesn't say what they did with the stable hand, but I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. But they decided they were going to kill her because of the shame she'd brought on their family. So they had a big party, so goes the legend, and invited all the relatives and told them all that she was going to live with other relatives in another country. And after everybody left the party, they had drugged her and walled her up inside the castle to die of suffocation. That's the legend. And everybody assumed it was just a legend. But this goes back hundreds of years. The legend can be found in their records of this castle from over 250 years ago. But in 1949, when they were knocking out parts of the wall on the fourth floor to put in new plumbing, they actually found her skeletal remains, or the skeletal remains of a young woman that actually had been walled up inside the castle, and she's still there. They've still got her there today. They did put a piece of plexiglass over the hole in the wall to keep tourists from stealing her bones, which is what they were doing for souvenirs. And so you can still see her there. Well, but the interesting thing is that this apparition has only been reported on that particular floor, and the apparition goes back several hundred years because we found records of it, and yet nobody knew that those bones were there on the fourth floor until 1949. So that's kind of an interesting correlation. But my experience was there was a small theater there where they used to put on plays for the nobility with a stage and probably about 30 or 40 seats. And I was in this theater. It's about 10 o'clock at night. This was in February, so it was the off-season for the hotel, very cold outside. There was no one else staying in the hotel, although there is a restaurant on the ground floor, so some of the locals come in there at night, and that closes down at 9. So there were a few staff members down on the ground floor. Other than that, I pretty much had the whole castle to myself. Wow. And I was up there on this in this theater, and suddenly I felt very, very cold. And I had a very strange feeling, almost an electrostatic type of feeling, and I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I looked toward the door, and I saw a woman in a white dress move past, wearing some kind of a veil, moving past the door completely silently. And it kind of shocked me for a moment. I went to the door and looked down the hall in the direction she was moving. There was nothing there. And went down to the end of the hall. The doors were locked. And those halls are made out of broad boards, so you really can't walk down the hall without making noise. I really don't think anybody could have come down that hallway without me hearing them coming, but I didn't hear anything at all. And, of course, later on I interviewed the staff members that were in the castle at the time, and none of them had been on the fourth floor at the time, and certainly wasn't anybody there who remotely resembled that. So, again, it was a very brief sighting, but certainly was an interesting one. So that's the extent of my personal apparitional experiences, although I have seen poltergeist activity on a number of occasions.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that in just a second. I do have a question from the chat room, Inception Radio Network chat room. Years ago, Dr. Nichols said ghosts were real, but whether they were spirits or the human mind being affected was the big question. Are you any closer now to answering that question?
You know, I wish I could say I was. But the reality is that the jury is still out on that question. You see, the problem is that in parapsychology, we recognize all of the components of the human mind that psychology recognizes. We understand that the human mind is capable of creating all sorts of forms and figures and archetypes and projections. But in addition to that, parapsychology also recognizes the existence of the phenomena called ESP and PK, or psychokinesis. And when you add ESP and psychokinesis to that ability of the mind to create all sorts of personifications and projections, which we do in our dreams all the time, when you add the components of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, then there really is no way to ever eliminate any case, because any case could be due to extrasensory perception. In other words, if you are able to get information from the past that is legitimate, that is veridical, verifiable, historical information that you could not have known before, and you get that information by seeing a ghost or by seeing an apparition, and of course there are thousands of cases like that in the literature, but if you get that sort of information, how could you ever rule out that it was actually a ghost, or whether your mind received extrasensory information from the past, which we call retrocognition, and then your mind presented that information to your consciousness in the form of a vision or in the form of an apparition created by your own mind, but incorporating information derived from ESP, which sounds a little complicated, but it really isn't. And then likewise, the same is true for objects movement, doors opening and closing in haunted locations or objects moving in poltergeist cases. We've been able to verify that many of those cases are directly tied to the subconscious or unconscious mind of a living person or agent. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case in poltergeist cases, then maybe it's also the case in haunting and other types of apparitional cases. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way, because even if you acknowledge the existence of spirits, you still have to go back to ESP and PK. And the reason for that is because spirits, by definition, do not have a physical body. So that means they don't have a musculoskeletal system. They don't have a sensory system. So any kind of sensory information that they receive or that they project to other people, which we use our voice for and our body language, anything like that would have to be some form of ESP, because they don't have any physical sensory system. So by definition, it's extrasensory. And anything that they affect in terms of physical matter, whether it's moving an object or percussive sounds on the walls, by definition would be some form of psychokinesis or mind over matter, because they don't have any muscles to do it with. So it could be that spirits exist, but that the what we call ESP and PK are really the spiritual analogs of our nervous system, of our physical nervous system. PK would be the spiritual analog of our motor nervous system, and ESP would be the spiritual analog of our sensory nervous system, if that makes sense. So in other words, when our muscles and our senses are gone, what we're left with is ESP and PK. So even if you have real spirits, you still are really studying ESP and PK, if that makes sense. So there's no way to distinguish whether that ESP and PK comes from your own subconscious mind, or does it come from some discarnate consciousness. There really is no way to determine that.
Absolutely, plausible. So here's a related question from me. What do you make some of this information coming from the past or wherever, especially some of the information that psychics get or seem to get? Could that come from something like an Akashic record or a universal consciousness?
Sure, and I think it most probably does. I mean, my opinion is that my opinion is that when you're dealing with things like hauntings, there are basically 5 different types. You have let me start even more basically than that. There are 3 main hypotheses or 3 main theories about what ghosts are. You have the psychological theory, which the skeptics and debunkers tend to embrace, and that is that these things are all generated by the mind, the unconscious mind of the individual, due to needs and fears that people have. And that's plausible. And then you have the spiritistic theory, which is that these things are non-corporeal entities of one kind or another. And there are several different versions of the spiritistic theory. You know, you have the spiritualist version, which says that these things are mostly spirits of the dead, and then you also have sort of a lot of the fundamentalist religious people who believe that they're demonic entities or angelic entities, or some people might believe they're interdimensional beings. But nevertheless, those are all spiritistic theories because they involve non-physical consciousness. And then you have the parapsychological theory. And the parapsychological theory is where I stand, and it's really about halfway in between. Because whereas the spiritistic theory believes that the phenomena themselves are physically real and can be experienced by more than one person at a time, for example, and they believe that these phenomena originate outside of the physical body or out from non-corporeal sources. And then you have the psychologists who believe that this stuff originates internally and that any perception of physical phenomena is purely an illusion. And then in the middle you have the parapsychologists who believe that, yes, these things may be generated internally, but we also believe that the phenomena are genuine and objectively real, that objects really do move and that people really do get information from the past and so on, because we add on that extra component of extrasensory perception and PK. So if you take what is known about the subconscious mind, the ability of the subconscious mind to generate all sorts of imagery and to project this, in other words, to experience it as if it were alien to you, and we're quite capable of doing that, and we all do it. Every time we dream at night, every time if you've ever had a dream of talking to another individual, for example, having a conversation with someone in a dream, and you get the feeling that you are here and the person you're talking to is there, and they're a separate person from you, and they may even express opinions which are different from your own, but in fact we know that those are actually fragments of your own consciousness, that those are creations and projections of yourself. So you're really talking to yourself, but it doesn't feel like you're talking to yourself.
Parts of yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And so the term for that is polypsychism, the idea that the mind is really split into many different parts, and that some of these parts can be quite autonomous and personified, so that they can act as though they were completely separate individuals. In the most extreme cases, we see that, of course, in multiple personality disorder. Right. But in reality, we all have that capability. Yeah. You know, it's not a pathological capability in most people, but it's something that we all have. And so if you add ESP and PK to that, well, then you have spirits, and you have probably Bigfoot, and you have aliens, and you have Mothmen and demons and angels and all the other various entities that people encounter. And I think that that's a very plausible theory, but it doesn't rule out that these things might have some form of independent autonomy as well. You know, I keep the door open to the existence of real spirits. I just don't know how you would ever scientifically prove that.
Yeah, and you know, that's a good point. And just as a side note, you know, when you're talking about parts, polypsychism, you know, that's another therapy, or an approach, I should say, we use in hypnosis, parts therapy.
Sure.
You know, bringing your parts together. Okay, we'll get off on that one now. All right, so here's another question from the chat room. This is from Sarah on the Inception Radio Network chat room. Can a particular ghost be the cause of the deaths of farm animals like sheep? Have such ghosts have any historical records on them?
Well, ghosts in particular are usually pretty harmless, but there certainly are other types of entities that are reported that do appear to attack farm animals. The famous chupacabra, of course, is a good example. But also there are other vampiric types of entities. Parts of the research that I'm conducting right now is in the area of supernatural assault. And I'm very interested in anyone who might have a supernatural assault-type experience to contact me and give me their experience, if they would, a narrative of their experience. where people believe that they've been assaulted by some type of entity of one type or another. And these things are quite common. Certainly I have seen cases where animals have been harmed in one way or another, but it's usually indirectly in haunting cases. For example, there was a case on a Texas ranch where the dogs reacted so violently to the presence of a ghost, or at least that's what we think, that they actually hanged themselves by jumping over the fence while attached to their leashes. And there were 2 dogs that actually were found hanged in this way for no other apparent reason, but they did react very, very violently to these experiences that the humans were also having. But as far as ghosts themselves attacking farm animals, I've never seen a case specifically like that. You know, it sounds more like the cattle mutilations associated with UFO type phenomena. But as you mentioned earlier, I think these things are really all interconnected. I don't think we're talking about 5 or 6 different types of phenomena here. I think there's really one type of phenomena that manifests itself in many different ways.
And let's talk about that. And that's something that I had mentioned to Dr. Nichols before we went on the air. And that's one of the things we've talked about a lot on this program is that, for all intents and purposes, ufology, parapsychology, and I'm talking about the haunting aspect of it, cryptozoology, Bigfoot, Mothman, different things, chupacabras, some stuff like that. They're all the same thing, only different. I mean, the phenomena seems to be the same. Think about it. Regardless of which one we're talking about, you get blurry pictures, you get like Bigfoot footprints, you get maybe trace evidence from a landing, a UFO landing, you see apparitions, you get all these eyewitness accounts, and we can't nail the suckers down.
That's right. That's right. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that they are all manifestations of a single phenomenon. Now,
well, what's really interesting about that is that kind of fits in. I'm sure both you guys are familiar with Jacques Vallée.
Absolutely.
And Jacques Vallée, says, listen, this may be something that we've, been in some sort of relationship with for thousands of years, that we've co-inhabited this place. And to me, it kind of fits in mind with, like, the young archetypes with, like, the trickster.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, I think Vallée is absolutely in agreement with that, and also John Keel, who wrote the Mothman prophecies. That was his theory as well. So we're certainly not the first to propose this, but the longer that I've been involved in investigating these types of high strangeness cases, the more I've come to realize that they're all part of a single pattern, really.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of different things. And I think that this is one of the problems in our field of study, that I think that these things are really all parapsychological, or many of them are.
Amen.
Not necessarily all of them. But I think you have these different groups that have their own agenda and their own hypothesis. For example, although there are ufologists like Jacques Vallée who do subscribe to this type of theory, the vast majority of people involved in the UFO community are still very emotionally committed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Right.
And in cryptozoology, you have these people who are pretty much universally committed to a biological organism hypothesis. Bigfoot is Gigantopithecus blacki, remnant populations of Gigantopithecus, which I think is extremely unlikely.
Which is really a shame, because then when they take that approach, I mean, that's like embracing what they believe to be a truism, and then it shuts down everything.
Well, that's right. They selectively ignore. That's right. They selectively ignore any data that does not fit with their hypothesis. And I think that you cannot. I used to, back when the International Society of Cryptozoology was still around, and they produced a wonderful journal, and I still have issues of the journal, and it was a great peer-reviewed journal, but I always thought it was kind of ironic because, on the one hand, they would have articles about the coelacanth or the giant squid or the okapi or other genuine biological organisms, so there's no question that there are animals that have not yet been described by science. That's genuine. So in that sense, cryptozoology is a genuine science, or a branch of zoology. But then side by side with that, they would have articles about Bigfoot, articles about Champ or other lake monsters, articles about Mothman. These things are completely different. It's apples and oranges. They're completely different phenomenon whatsoever. If you look at them honestly, you can see that these are distinctly parapsychological phenomena. These things appear and disappear. They exist in areas where biological organisms of that size couldn't possibly exist. Like here in Florida, we have more Bigfoot sightings here than any other state east of the Mississippi River. And there can't just be one or two of them. If these are biological organisms, there would have to be hundreds, a breeding population that sustained a viable gene pool. And that's just not physically possible. There would be a body, there would be skeletal remains, there would be fossil remains. And there's no fossil remains in the fossil record anywhere in North America of any kind of ape-like anthropoid. And plus, Bigfoot I investigated a whole series of Bigfoot sightings back in the 1970s and 1980s here in the Ocala National Forest, and they were associated with UFO sightings. They were associated with poltergeist activity and a variety of other luminous anomalies, variety of other paranormal phenomena were associated with these sightings. I even have a cast of a Florida Bigfoot print that was taken by an archaeologist and taken to the Florida Museum of Natural History Mammalogy Department. They didn't know what to do with it, so they gave it to me. But this guy's completely credible, and this was during the period they were having Bigfoot sightings not far from Gainesville, a little town called Barden. They called it the Barden Booger back in those days.
Well, we did an interesting investigation there, too, of a gentleman who went back. This went back about 20 years, not the investigation, but his history. He had a cabin in a very remote area up there and told a pretty compelling abduction story.
So, there are three possibilities. Either all these people are lying, all these people are crazy, or they really are experiencing and reporting exactly what they claim to be experiencing. And I believe that that's the case. But at the same time, it cannot possibly be what it seems to be, and that is some, biological organism. And I think a good example that I often relate to my students is the example of the black cat sightings. Of course, in England, you have a lot of black dog sightings. You have a few of those here, too. But in the United States, it's mostly black cat sightings. Black cat sightings are made year after year, hundreds of them in almost every state in the continental United States. Here in Florida, we have several dozen every year. I have talked to long-time experienced hunters who collectively, I talked to two hunters that saw a black panther not 20 miles from here several years ago that left tracks. I even have a cast of the track, and it looked, for all the world, looks like a large panther track. And so, of course, the most logical explanation that most people put forth is, well, of course, there are populations of black panthers. We know there are Florida panthers, and we know there are cougars out west, so why couldn't there be a population of melanistic or all-black cats? We know that there are melanistic leopards, and that's what people used to call black panthers, were melanistic Asian leopards. So it seems perfectly plausible that there could actually be black panthers roaming around in the woods
an albino.
Florida, yeah, it's the opposite. Melanistic is the opposite of leucistic or albino. So it seems logical to most people that, sure, there are panthers in Georgia, there are panthers in Tennessee, there are panthers in Florida roaming around, and they're black. And there are hundreds of witnesses to prove this. The problem is that it's biologically impossible. And the reason why it is, or at least highly improbable, and the reason is back during the 1800s when cougars were much more widespread than they are now, and the reason that they're extinct in states east of the Mississippi River, except for Florida, is because the ranchers hated them and because they killed their livestock and so on. So the government put a bounty on panthers or cougars, mountain lions, whatever you want to call them. And so as a result, ranchers and hunters were killing them by the thousands, and it rendered them extinct in most states, according to the wildlife biologists, except for, again, small population in South Florida and, of course, out west. But these, in order to collect their bounties, they had to turn the skins in, the pelts. And so these pelts were all shipped to the Smithsonian Institution. The result is there are several 100,000 pelts of American cougars in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution going back to the mid-1800s. And do you know how many of those are black? Not one. Not a single one. There is no evidence that there ever was a melanistic panther or black panther in the United States at all. And yet, every year, hundreds of people in states all over the United States see them. So, if you're involved in this type of work, you can't just ignore that fact. It can't possibly be what it appears to be, and that is, a population of actual panthers. So it is some type of a cryptid in the same way that Bigfoot is a type of cryptid
Right.
that appears to appear and disappear. It appears to be able to interact with physical matter to the extent that it can be, they can leave footprints, they can be collectively viewed. So it's much more like an apparition, because apparitions or ghosts do exactly the same thing. They can be seen by people, but they disappear. They look completely solid, but they disappear. They walk through walls. They can interact with physical matter, but they typically leave no trace behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically what we're dealing with here is some type of apparitional phenomena, which puts it in the realm of parapsychology, not in the realm of zoology.
And and that's something that we have talked about a lot as well. In my opinion, and this is perhaps not the way it is in the quote real world, but in my opinion, parapsychology ought to be addressing these very things. Why are people seeing these things, reporting these things? And perhaps parapsychology is just diverse, because I know there are parapsychologists who absolutely don't believe in ghosts or hauntings or spirits or anything. It's all PK, it's all RSPK, it's all psi phenomena. And yet it seems to me that we ought to be expanding, and maybe you can address this, expanding parapsychology, the definition, to include why are we seeing these things as a community, as a population, when it's beyond psychology.
Well, some of us do. I'm an example of one who does investigate these things, and there are a few others who do. I think that, since parapsychology as a scientific discipline, and you can argue all day about whether or not it's an actual science. I don't really care whether people think it's a science or not.
Good
a lot of people think psychology is a science or sociology. It is a social science at least as much as psychology, sociology, and anthropology are sciences, so I regard it as a science, but it doesn't really matter because it's definitely a scholarly discipline. But parapsychology since the 1930s has been dominated, at least here in the United States, has been dominated by the Rhinean school, or the Rhinean model of J.B. Rhine, which focuses on laboratory, replicable, statistical analysis, or the quantitative approach to psi phenomena. And I think that's very important work, and I'm glad that people are doing it. But I've never been particularly interested in it, except insofar as it provides data that reinforces our understanding of what these things are, what these abilities are. But my approach is much more qualitative, and I really, my mentor in parapsychology, or one of my major mentors, was Hans Bender. I don't know if you're familiar with
Heard
Bender.
the name.
Well, Bender was the number one post-World War II. He died a number of years ago, but he was in Germany. And he founded the Institute for Border Areas of Psychology and Mental Health, which is basically the Institute of Parapsychology, in Freiburg, Germany. And he was certainly a great influence on me because his focus was always on the qualitative, the human experience. And so that's what I focus on, and that's what the American Institute of Parapsychology, my organization, focuses on, that these things are first and foremost a human experience. So when people scoff at my area of research, basically my response is this: it doesn't matter whether you believe these things are objectively real or not. They are phenomenologically real in that people experience them. They are a genuine part of the human experience, just like falling in love is a genuine part of the human experience. And you can't measure or quantify falling in love directly. You can do it indirectly. You can measure, the number, you can statistically analyze the number of people who fall in love and under what circumstances they fall in love. And that's what you can do in parapsychology. We cannot directly measure ghosts. In spite of the fact that many ghost hunters think that you can, but I don't think that you can directly measure ghosts, and I'm not even certain that ghosts can be photographed or recorded. I'm not at all convinced by most of the evidence that's presented along those lines.
Well,
what I do know is that people do experience these things, and that no attempt to understand the psyche of human beings is complete without trying to understand this particular class of experiences that we call anomalous or paranormal. So that's why parapsychology is important.
Absolutely, and one of the observations that I think is that what we're coming to, or what we're going to have to come to, and not only because I've been a big investigator of near-death experiences, and I think that what we're going to have to get to, or what we're gradually moving our way towards, is towards a whole a different way of defining what consciousness is. And I think therein is what it's all about and what you've been talking about, Doctor. I think it's, and I think that what we fail to do is we fail to celebrate that. And I think that we also have to look at it as each individual is absolutely unique in the sense that, well, you know what, their radio station may be tuned to one station up more on the FM band, and for some reason they may be able to plug into whatever energy or that we co-inhabit this space, or whether it's periodically or whether it's all the time. And that's what I think is going to yield the best results is how our consciousness operates and how it interacts with our environment.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that parapsychology has really made one significant contribution, and that is all of the data from parapsychology, whether you're talking about ESP or psychokinesis or data, the so-called theta evidence, such as near-death experiences, mediumistic communications, and so forth, the phenomena suggestive of survival after death. All of these phenomena, all of the data from parapsychology really boils down to one thing, and that is that the dualistic notion of the encapsulated consciousness is a myth. It's an illusion. The idea that consciousness is encapsulated in the physical brain and is limited to the physical brain is a myth.
Right.
Now, we can't prove for sure whether that consciousness survives death, or if it does, in what form or for how long. I mean, there are many different variations of the survival hypothesis, and we can't prove it one way or the other. But what we can say is that all of the evidence from parapsychology, from ESP experiments, psychokinesis, and so on, as well as the anecdotal evidence and case studies, many thousands of them in cultures all over the world, all of these things demonstrate one thing, and that is that there's really no such thing as the encapsulated consciousness. That consciousness is really a web of interconnectedness that connects us to all other human beings, that our strongest connections are with those with whom we have strong emotional connections, because it's within those localized connections that we have most of our psi experiences. But we also are connected to the rest of human beings, and at a more basic level to the rest of nature, to the cosmos itself. So it's as if we're one cell in a giant superorganism. And again, this isn't a new theory, but all of the data from parapsychology really suggests that one revolutionary idea, which flies in the face of the monistic views of Western scientists, including most mainstream psychologists. And I think that's really the message of parapsychology, that all of this stuff has to do with, as you said, non-locality consciousness. That's really what it all boils down to, and it can manifest itself in many different ways.
And the thing about it that's for me that I find so fascinating is it's like we are so much more than we really think we are.
That's right.
We are so much more, and how we interface with that energy that's out there is going to take us a long time to understand.
You know, and you mentioned Carl Jung a while ago, and I'm definitely a Jungian psychologist in my approach. And one thing that he noted, and that many other psychologists and analysts have noted since then, is that consciousness, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg. Our conscious ego is the tip of the iceberg, and the deeper you go into the unconscious mind, the more undifferentiated it becomes, and the more personified it becomes, so that these separate parts become increasingly personified. And so, I have come under some criticism from people. People always regard me as either being a complete skeptic, or they regard me as being a complete naive dupe, because they don't really understand what I'm trying to say. For example, I've told many people in my paranormal investigation class that, in my opinion, many of the old spiritualist techniques, that you and I mentioned crystal balls a while ago, the crystal ball, pendulums, dowsing rods, table tilting, Ouija boards, these things in many ways are more relevant to parapsychology than EMF meters and infrared thermometers are. And the reason, even though people associate these things, and of course my book, Ghost Detective Adventures of a Parapsychologist, goes into this in great detail, because people associate these types of tools with sideshow spiritualists and gypsy fortune tellers. But in fact, these were all tools that were developed over a period of thousands of years in cultures all over the world, and they were developed for the purpose of accessing the deeper levels of the mind. And it is in those deeper levels of the mind that ESP and PK originates, or at least is transmitted. All the evidence from parapsychological studies in the laboratory show that this is the case, that ESP and PK originate at the level of the unconscious mind, and only occasionally do they percolate into consciousness for most people. The people that we call psychics and mediums are simply people that have a more permeable boundary between their conscious mind and their unconscious mind. They're able to to acquire information from the unconscious much more readily than the average person is. And so these things that I mentioned, these tools, are all designed to facilitate access to unconscious material. Crystal balls really do work. If you sit in a dim room with a candle burning and you stare into a crystal ball, most people after a period of time will start to see visions in the balls. The pendulums really do work. Now, that doesn't mean they're guided by a spirit hand, but the information is coming either through your sensory system in the form of these visions, or in the form of your motor system in terms of table tilting or the movement of a Ouija board or automatic writing. These things are amplifiers. These tools are amplifiers for unconscious material.
Or maybe it's the belief that the object can be the receptacle of that energy. Because we've done table tippings on many occasions, and my feeling has been that, and Doug and I have talked about this, and we've done it on the radio shows. My feeling has been that it's that psychokinetic energy, and I'm just wondering, in your experience, do you think that if you have somebody who has the gift, or somebody that has psychic abilities, and that boundary line is they can get information? I'm just wondering, can they augment? Do you think that they augment others' ability?
Absolutely.
To unleash
in terms of collective PK, for example, and I think you're right. I think that there's a fine line. It's just and again, you have to be familiar. This is what I always recommend to people who want to be paranormal investigators, that you have to understand something about psychology. You cannot just be ignorant of psychology and expect to really understand any of these phenomena, because there is a fine line between the phenomenon of subliminal communication, for example, and extrasensory perception. In fact, the two, ESP is really a variant or a form of subliminal perception. And psychology knows a lot about subliminal perception and how it works. So to really understand ESP, you have to understand subliminal perception. The same is true of what you just mentioned about table tilting. The same is true of psychokinesis. It is true that most of the movement associated with pendulums, Ouija boards, and table tilting and so on are subliminal muscular movements that are created by the operator unconsciously. But if you do that enough, you can unleash genuine psychokinesis. This is what happened in the famous Philip experiment, of course, where they created an artificial ghost. And so my feeling in haunted houses is that most people actually create their own ghosts. They haunt their own houses. They create their own projections. They charge them with psychokinesis, and they acquire information from the history of the location through ESP, and they generate an artificial being or artificial ghost, because the reality is I haven't seen a lot of evidence that most houses are haunted by actual spirits of the dead. They seem to be projections, but they're projections that can be perceived by others. They're projections that can interact with physical matter. So these are remarkable powers of the mind. That's what parapsychology is really.
It's really interesting because we've gone on investigations where we've seen nothing significant, but if one person in that household believes that there's something going on there, then that person can make everybody else in the household come around to that belief. And it all depends on a number of factors, but number one that we've seen is what their personal belief system is and what their cultural belief system is. And a lot of times we've gone in there and, folks will, even though we can find nothing, will tell us that something is still here. So the power of belief is absolutely an intricate part of this whole process.
It really is, but you have to remember also that this power of belief is not just a matter of psychological predisposition. I mean, psychologists are always very fond of saying, seeing is believing, but believing is also seeing. So if you believe in it, it will make you see something that really isn't there. The problem is, if you look at ESP experiments done in the laboratory, a long time ago, Gertrude Smeidler, the well-known parapsychologist, coined the term the sheep-goat effect, because in parapsychology experiments where you have double-blind, controlled experiments of ESP, you find that people who believe in ESP actually do better in laboratory experiments than people who don't. And so the people who believe, she called sheep, and the people who don't believe, she called goats. So my point is that belief is not just a matter of being psychologically predisposed to seeing something that isn't there. Believing can also make you see something that really is there.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it does.
Let me, I got to get to a couple of questions here, and then I have another question of my own that I want to get your input on. Real quick, it came up earlier. You had talked about ESP. When you're on a location, there's an ESP exchange between spirits and ghosts. So basically, the question is, it's already scrolled off the chat screen. This is from Kathy. ESP is the form of communication between spirits and humans, and the question is, how do you know whether it's coming from another human there or a ghost?
And the answer is you don't, and that was really my whole point before, is that there is no way to know.
Okay.
We don't know. The only thing I said was that you can speculate. In other words, every human ability has a survival benefit. That evolution has endowed us with various perceptions, various abilities, various senses for a very specific purpose, to enable us to survive in one way or another. And so if ESP and PK are genuine, and we believe that they are, then what would be the purpose of such abilities? We don't seem to be able to use them very well at will. We seem to have a filtering mechanism in our conscious mind, a defense mechanism that prevents us from using ESP and PK. Otherwise, we'd be walking around using it all the time. We'd be reading each other's minds. We'd be making our people that cut us off in traffic would be bursting into flames, and so on. And so this would not be conducive to human survival. And so I think that what you have here are repressed types of abilities in the unconscious mind that are only occasionally percolating into consciousness due to a glitch in this filtering mechanism. And so my point here is that one possible purpose for the existence of ESP and PK might be to give us a means by which we can communicate after death, and a means by which we can interact with other beings and with physical matter after death. That's the only purpose I can think of. Since it doesn't seem to do us much good while we're alive, maybe it serves a purpose after we're dead. But that's just speculation.
Sure.
But the answer to the question is that there is no way to know for sure whether or not such ESP communication comes from a living person or from a person who's dead. And I think most of the time it comes from a living person. As I said, I have found very little to suggest the activity of actual spirits of the dead in the over 600 haunting cases that I've investigated.
All right, so here's another question. This is going to probably have to be the last question we can take from the chat because we're running out of time. But this is a good question. Since channeling is related to ESP, can a person unconsciously channel a place memory and influence or haunt the location through PK to cause an intelligent haunting?
Well, that's kind of a complex question, but I think I understand what they're getting at, and I think the answer is yes. To give you an example, I think that most hauntings or most ghosts are a type of psychic projection, or psi projection is the term that we use. Mm-hmm. That basically it's a thought form, and that's the occultist term. Similar to the tulpa in tantric magic in Tibet, or the egregore in Western Hermetic magic, or the Philip experiment where they created an artificial ghost. I think that people unconsciously create artificial ghosts, and that under certain circumstances, particularly when they're powerfully charged with emotion, they become imprinted in the environment and can be perceived by others who are sensitive enough to see them. And a good example of that would be graveyard ghosts, because graveyard ghosts are found all over the world. But it's always occurred to me that if I were a spirit, why would I hang out in a graveyard? I mean, really, what would be the purpose of just wandering around in a graveyard? So my feeling is that graveyard ghosts are actually projections by the living. In other words, the mourners create the ghost. People who go to the graveside of their loved ones day after day or week after week, and they're visualizing what that person looked like when they're alive, and they're charging this image with powerful emotion, and over time it builds up an imprint so that vision, that image, remains in that localized area and can be perceived by others who are sensitive enough to perceive it. And so there you have your graveyard ghost that just wanders aimlessly through the graveyard, because it's really just a kind of recording generated by the minds of the living mourners.
A psychic projection.
Exactly. And I think you see the same thing in theaters. It's occurred to me for many years that almost every live theater is haunted. You know, here in Gainesville, we have 4 live theaters, and they all have a ghost. And that seems unlikely in terms of most of the time there have been no violent deaths or anything like that. So I believe that those ghosts are created by the actors themselves. Actors are trained to project powerful emotions. They're trained to visualize these characters. There have been numerous examples throughout history of authors who have been haunted by their own literary creations, literally haunted. And so I think that most ghosts are these psychic projections created by the living, but then they can hang around as residual imprints after the death of the individual. But that's something different.
Well, especially it's really interesting when you say that about a theater, because not only are the actors having an emotional response, but so is the audience. So who's to say that that energy that's dispersed is not hanging in that area, or remnants of that energy is still hanging? Interesting, fascinating.
I think you're absolutely right. I think if you have a very emotionally charged play, then the entire audience, as well as the actors, are collectively involved in generating a psychokinetic or telepathically charged image, which may remain for decades or even centuries in some cases.
And like places of great violence, like Lap Castle or other places where these horrendous acts have been, I can see where incredible amounts of emotion would imprint themselves on that environment or whatever.
All right, so we have less than 6 minutes left, and let's get to this question. It kind of came up in the chat, but I thought, wow, that would be a good one to get your take on, and that is possessions. What's your take on possessions?
Well, possession is a legitimate phenomenon. It's even recognized, of course, by the psychiatric community as a recognized psychiatric disorder called dissociative trance disorder or possession syndrome. And I've actually done a lot of research on possession. So people actually do become possessed. The question is, what is it that's possessing the ego? I mean, many analytical psychologists believe that these are subpersonalities, or another example of polypsychism, where you have unconscious, what Carl Jung called autonomous complexes, that can basically acquire enough energy, enough psychic energy to take over the ego of the individual. And so it appears to be a completely alien being or alien person simply because you've never seen it before, because it's been buried in your unconscious. But, again, there's also the possibility of actual discarnate entity possession, and I've seen a few cases that strongly suggest that. So I don't rule out that possibility.
Okay, good answer. Short answer. I thought it would involve more, and that's pretty much in line with what we've talked about before too. All right, so let's talk about your book and your website and where people can get your book.
My book is Ghost Detective: Adventures of a Parapsychologist, which is available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on, Books A Million. Also, I have a chapter in a new anthology, paranormal anthology, that's coming out in August called Ghost, Spirits, and Hauntings, Am I Being Haunted?, which should be interesting. But in terms of my book is different, I think, from any other type of ghost hunting book that you're going to find for a couple of reasons. Number one, the emphasis is on the experience of the people themselves, not on technology. Because I think the technology, although interesting and provides some valuable data, it has its limitations. And the techniques that I use in the book are much more in keeping with the classical spiritistic techniques, even though I don't regard myself as a spiritualist. But you mentioned table tilting, automatic writing. These are the types of things that I use in many cases. And the other thing that makes the book unique is that I give very specific instructions on how to de-haunt houses, because that's something that almost nobody else is talking about, that you can actually, if you understand the dynamics, the psychological dynamics behind these ghosts and what creates most of the ghosts, not all of them. The imprints cannot be de-haunted in this way, but the ones that are generated by someone who's living in the environment, which constitutes the majority of cases, can actually be neutralized. And I've been able to do this in dozens of cases, essentially using techniques borrowed from clinical psychology, hypnotherapy, and classical spiritual seances. So the book describes this in great detail. And as far as I know, that's the only book that includes information about how to actually get rid of a ghost if you need to.
So without any further ado, Dr. Andrew Nichols, parapsychologist, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone.
It is really nice to have you. So you're hailing from Gainesville, Florida, correct?
That's right. 106 degrees it was up here today.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's pretty warm down here, too, Doc.
I'll bet.
Yeah, and you are a professor at Santa Fe Community College, correct?
That's right. I'm an adjunct professor right now. I was a full-time professor and department chair, professor of psychology and department chair at City College for about 15 years, and I semi-retired from teaching last fall, and so now I'm teaching part-time. I teach at Santa Fe, and I also teach abnormal psychology at a local Oriental medicine college.
Well, that's cool. And so you're teaching parapsychology, and let's just start with that. What got you into parapsychology?
Well, that goes back to my childhood. I was born in West Virginia and spent the first 13 years of my life there. This was during the early to mid and late 1960s. And during that period of time, West Virginia was quite a hot zone for paranormal experiences, even going back into the 1950s with the Flatwoods Monster, which was associated with a UFO sighting. That was a little before my time. But while I lived there, there was a whole... And then one night, something woke me up, and I rolled over, and there she was, standing in my room, just smiling at me. She looked completely solid, wasn't transparent or anything like that, although she did appear to be faintly luminous. I remember being able to see objects in the room that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to see, so there was a kind of a luminous quality to the experience. And when I went to get out of bed, she disappeared. Didn't say anything, which is quite typical for apparitional-type experiences. And that made a profound effect on me, had a profound effect on me. I wasn't sure if I was crazy or what had happened. Never was very religious in a conventional sense. And so I began doing a little research in the library, and I discovered not only do many people have such experiences, that they're actually quite common, but also that there's a whole branch of psychology that specializes in studying just those things, and that would be parapsychology. Yeah. So really from that moment on, from the time I was 12 years old, I was determined that that's what I was going to do. So that's how I got started.
Well, that's good. So you've been doing it for a year or two. So what, you're 29 now? And that puts you,
that's true.
Puts you to about 30 years?
I've been doing serious research, I would say, for about 34 years now. Although I was interested in it, again, even longer than that.
Well, in your ensuing 34 years since you had that experience with your sister, have you experienced anything similar?
Well, I have seen apparitions on two other occasions, and this was during haunting investigations. I was investigating Oak Alley Plantation in Vacherie, Louisiana, which some of your listeners may be familiar with because it was used in the movie Interview with a Vampire. Beautiful old plantation. And I saw a young woman looking out the window at me from a second floor window. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. She seemed to be wearing an old-fashioned dress. And again, this was during the daylight. I was walking around outside the plantation, and I really didn't think much of it. Had a camera around my neck, didn't even try to take a picture of her because I assumed she was one of the docents or tour guides that they have. The plantation is a museum now. And so I assumed she was just one of the docents looking out the window. And later on, I got to meet all the docents that were there. There weren't any tourists there on the day that we were there. It was on a Sunday afternoon. And I didn't see this girl among them, so I asked them where she was and who she was. And they told me that there was no such person that worked there, but they told me that it did sound like the ghost that people had seen. So I went up to that room, and actually the window that I had seen her looking out of had a big exhaust fan mounted in it. And so there was actually no way I could have seen a person standing in the place that I saw. Of course, when I went back outside, I could see the exhaust fan very well, and so I really had no explanation for it. So that was an interesting experience. And then the third time was at a place in Denmark called Dralsholm Castle. And on the fourth floor of the castle, which has been turned into a hotel, there's a ghost that people see and have seen for over 200 years. There are records of this ghost. They call her Den Hvide Dame in Danish, which means the lady in white. And, of course, there are a lot of those around the world. But there's a legend that goes along with this one that's actually quite interesting, and some interesting evidence. The legend is that hundreds of years ago, a young woman who was the daughter of one of the noblemen who lived in this castle had fallen in love with a stable hand and had become pregnant. And when her family found out about it, they were so furious that she had, become pregnant with this commoner's baby that they decided they were going to kill her. The legend doesn't say what they did with the stable hand, but I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. But they decided they were going to kill her because of the shame she'd brought on their family. So they had a big party, so goes the legend, and invited all the relatives and told them all that she was going to live with other relatives in another country. And after everybody left the party, they had drugged her, and a rash of UFO sightings, and, of course, the Mothman phenomenon occurred there in Point Pleasant. Point Pleasant was only about 25 miles from where I lived, a little place called Cross Lanes, and I knew several of the people who had seen Mothman, and also one person who had a rather remarkable UFO sighting. In fact, he appeared very briefly in the book Mothman Prophecies by John Keel. A fellow by the name of Tad Jones was a friend of my father's who owned an appliance store there in Cross Lanes, and he had said that he had seen a spherical craft on tripod legs landed right on the uncompleted branch of Interstate 64 early one morning on his way to work. And so I was fascinated by all this. So that was really the beginning of it. And, like a lot of other kids of those days, I was fascinated with television shows like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits. But what really solidified it for me was I had my own paranormal experience. I never did see Mothman or any of the UFOs, but I was collecting the clippings and was interested in it. But when I was 12 years old, my older sister died in an automobile accident. And after her death, I began having a series of recurring nightmares about her death. And this went on for several weeks. I'd wake up in a cold sweat several nights a week. And